I found the photograph at an antique market in Providence, Rhode Island. It was a Sunday in November, one of those grey autumn days when the wind off the water cuts through your coat, and the old colonial buildings seem to hold centuries of secrets. The market was held in a converted warehouse near the waterfront, packed with dealers selling everything from furniture to books to old photographs. I was browsing through a box of medical memorabilia when I found it. A photograph showing 8 women in nursing uniforms with distinctive Red Cross armbands and caps, arranged in 2 rows. The image was in good condition, professionally taken, showing the nurses posed formally in front of what appeared to be a brick building. What immediately struck me was the variety in the nurses' uniforms and the presence of what looked like Red Cross symbols on their aprons. This suggested they were part of a Red Cross unit, possibly during World War I. 5 nurses stood in the back row. 3 sat in the front, all looking serious and professional, as was typical of the era. The dealer noticed my interest. "That's from St. Michael's Hospital," he said. "Used to be on the east side of Providence. Building was torn down in the 1960s, but that photograph has quite a history. Dark history, actually." "What kind of history?" I asked. "Those 8 nurses all died on the same night in 1916. Found sealed in the basement ward of the hospital. The whole thing was hushed up at the time. Bad for the hospital's reputation. Bad for morale during the war. But the story survived. My grandfather worked at that hospital in the 1930s, and he used to tell me about it. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, was written, St. Michael's Hospital, Red Cross Nursing Unit, Providence, Rhode Island, September 1916. And below that, in different handwriting, clearly added later, all 8 murdered. October 15th, 1916. Basement ward sealed for 40 years. May their souls rest in peace. I bought the photograph along with a small collection of related materials, newspaper clippings, hospital records, and what appeared to be portions of an investigation report, for $200. That evening in my hotel room, I spread everything out and began piecing together one of the most disturbing stories I'd encountered in my years of researching historical photographs. The newspaper clippings began with reports from October 1916. From the Providence Journal, October 17th, 1916. 8 nurses missing from St. Michael's Hospital. Extensive search underway. Authorities are searching for 8 nurses from St. Michael's Hospital who failed to report for their shifts on the morning of October 16th and have not been seen since the evening of October 15th. The missing nurses are members of the hospital's Red Cross unit. Sister Margaret Flynn, head nurse, age 34. Nurse Catherine Walsh, age 28. Nurse Dorothy Patterson, age 26. Nurse Elizabeth Chen, age 27. Nurse Sarah Kowalski, age 24. Nurse Ruth Morrison, age 29. Nurse Ann Murphy, age 25. Nurse Helen Foster, age 23. The nurses were last seen during the evening shift on October 15th, when they were caring for patients in the hospital's wards. When the night shift arrived at 11 p.m., the 8 nurses could not be located. Hospital Administrator Dr. James Thornton stated, "We are deeply concerned for the well-being of these dedicated nurses. We have searched the hospital thoroughly and are working with police to locate them." But the next clipping told a very different and much more horrifying story. From the Providence Journal, October 19th, 1916. Bodies of 8 nurses discovered, sealed in hospital basement patient, charged with multiple murders. In a shocking development, the bodies of 8 missing St. Michael's Hospital nurses have been discovered sealed in a basement ward that had been locked and barricaded from the inside. The grim discovery was made yesterday afternoon, when hospital maintenance workers investigating strange odors broke through a door that had been blocked by heavy equipment and furniture. Inside, they found the bodies of all 8 missing nurses. Police have arrested Edwin Blackwood, 42, a patient who had been admitted to St. Michael's psychiatric ward 3 weeks ago. Blackwood, diagnosed with severe schizophrenia, is believed to have lured the nurses into the basement ward on the evening of October 15th, then sealed them inside. According to police, the basement ward had been undergoing renovation and was not in regular use. Blackwood apparently convinced the nurses that a patient required urgent care in that location. Once all 8 women were inside the ward, he barricaded the doors and windows from the outside, trapping them. The nurses died of suffocation and dehydration over the course of approximately 2 days. Evidence suggests they attempted to escape, but were unable to break through the barricaded exits. Providence Police Chief William Morrison stated, "This is one of the most horrific crimes in the city's history. A man entrusted to the care of these dedicated nurses used deception to trap and murder them. Our investigation is ongoing, but we believe Blackwood acted alone." Hospital officials have expressed profound grief and shock at the tragedy. I found more detailed accounts in the investigation files. The story that emerged was even more disturbing than the newspaper reports suggested. From the Providence Police Department Investigation Report, October 1916. Investigation into the deaths of 8 nurses at St. Michael's Hospital. On October 15, 1916, at approximately 9:30 p.m., patient Edwin Blackwood, who had been admitted to the psychiatric ward on September 25th with diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, approached night nurse supervisor Sister Margaret Flynn. According to testimony from other staff members, Blackwood told Sister Flynn that he had witnessed another patient, a man Blackwood claimed was dangerous and potentially violent, sneaking toward the basement level of the hospital, where renovation work was being conducted. Blackwood told Sister Flynn that this patient had spoken of harming nurses, and that immediate action was needed. He was apparently convincing and coherent, lucid in a way he had not been for most of his hospitalization. Sister Flynn gathered 7 other nurses and proceeded to the basement ward to investigate Blackwood's claims. This was the last time the 8 nurses were seen alive by anyone except their killer. What happened next has been reconstructed from physical evidence and from Blackwood's own confused and rambling statements to police. Blackwood followed the nurses to the basement ward. Once all 8 women were inside the room searching for the non-existent dangerous patient, Blackwood closed and locked the door from the outside. He then spent approximately 3 hours moving heavy equipment, furniture, and materials from the renovation site to barricade all exits from the ward, including the door and 2 small windows. The basement ward was in a section of the hospital that was not regularly used during the renovation period. The door was heavy and the walls thick. The nurses' cries for help were not heard by anyone. By the time hospital staff realized the nurses were missing on the morning of October 16th, Blackwood had returned to the psychiatric ward and was found sleeping in his bed. He showed no signs of agitation or unusual behavior when questioned about the missing nurses, claiming he knew nothing about their whereabouts. The bodies were discovered on October 18th, when maintenance workers, investigating complaints of unusual odors, broke through the barricaded door. Medical examination indicates the nurses survived for approximately 36 to 48 hours after being sealed in the ward. Death was caused by a combination of factors, including oxygen deprivation, the ward was not well ventilated, dehydration, and extreme stress. Evidence suggests the nurses attempted desperately to escape, trying to break down the door and windows, but the barricades were too strong. Edwin Blackwood has been charged with 8 counts of murder. He has provided confused and contradictory statements to investigators, sometimes claiming the nurses were demons or imposters who needed to be contained, other times claiming he was following orders from voices he heard, and occasionally denying any knowledge of the events. Psychiatric evaluation indicates Blackwood was experiencing severe psychotic delusions at the time of the crimes, but was lucid enough to plan and execute a complex series of actions designed to trap and kill the nurses. I found testimony from hospital staff who had interacted with Edwin Blackwood during his time as a patient. From the testimony of Dr. Robert Harrison, October 20th, 1916. Edwin Blackwood was admitted to St. Michael's on September 25th, 1916, brought in by his family, who reported he had been experiencing increasingly severe psychotic episodes. Blackwood had a history of mental illness dating back at least 5 years. He had been institutionalized twice before, released both times after showing improvement, only to relapse within months. His symptoms included paranoid delusions. He believed people were conspiring against him, that women in particular were plotting to harm him or control his mind. He heard voices telling him to protect himself from these threats. He exhibited periods of lucidity, interrupted by episodes of profound disorganization and fear. During his 3 weeks at St. Michael's, Blackwood was generally compliant with treatment. He took his medications, participated in therapeutic activities, and showed no signs of violence. However, several nurses reported that he made them uncomfortable, staring at them intensely, making odd comments about their true nature, asking unusual questions about ward routines and hospital layout. In retrospect, these behaviors suggest he was planning something, but at the time, they seemed merely like symptoms of his illness, not indications of dangerous intent. On the evening of October 15th, Blackwood apparently experienced a period of lucidity that allowed him to execute his plan. He was coherent enough to convince Sister Flynn that a dangerous situation required immediate attention, coherent enough to follow through with the complex task of barricading the ward, but still profoundly delusional about the need to trap and contain the nurses. I have treated mentally ill patients for 15 years, and I have never encountered a case quite like this. Blackwood's combination of severe delusion and functional capability proved tragically lethal. From the testimony of Nurse Mary Brennan, who had not been working on October 15th, October 21st, 1916, Mr. Blackwood always made me uncomfortable. There was something in the way he looked at us nurses, like he was studying us, trying to figure something out about us. About a week before the murders, he asked me strange questions. He wanted to know where all the exits in the hospital were located. He asked about the basement wards, whether anyone used them, whether they were locked. At the time, I thought he was just anxious about being confined, maybe planning an escape. I reported it to the supervising physician, but nothing came of it. The night of October 15th, I wasn't working, but I knew all 8 of the nurses who died. Sister Margaret was my mentor. She taught me everything I know about nursing. Catherine and Dorothy were my friends. I had worked alongside all of them for years. When I learned what happened to them, that they'd been sealed in that basement ward, trapped for 2 days, dying slowly while the hospital went about its business overhead, I felt sick. I still feel sick. I dream about it. I imagine what they must have gone through in those hours, the hope turning to despair, the realization that no one was coming to save them. And I feel guilty. I noticed Blackwood's strange behavior. I reported it, but I didn't push harder. Maybe if I had, someone would have recognized he was dangerous. Maybe those 8 women would still be alive. I found letters written by family members of the murdered nurses, expressing grief and anger. From a letter by Thomas Flynn, brother of Sister Margaret Flynn, to the hospital administrator, November 1916. Dr. Thornton, my sister Margaret devoted her life to nursing. She entered religious service specifically to care for the sick and vulnerable. She believed her work at St. Michael's was a sacred calling. She was murdered by a man who was a patient in your hospital, a man you were supposed to be supervising and controlling. She and 7 other dedicated nurses died in the most horrific way imaginable, sealed in a basement, slowly suffocating, knowing they'd been abandoned. You say this tragedy could not have been predicted, that Edwin Blackwood showed no signs of violent intent. But I have spoken with nurses who worked with him, and they all say he made them uncomfortable, that he exhibited concerning behaviors, that they reported their concerns. Those concerns were dismissed. And now my sister is dead. St. Michael's Hospital failed in its duty to protect its staff. You allowed a dangerous patient to have freedom of movement throughout the hospital. You failed to adequately secure areas where vulnerable staff might be isolated. You failed to take seriously the concerns raised by your nursing staff about Blackwood's behavior. And when 8 nurses went missing, it took you nearly 3 days to find them. 3 days while their bodies lay sealed in a basement room in your own hospital. This is unacceptable. My sister deserved better. All 8 of those nurses deserved better. I am pursuing legal action against St. Michael's Hospital for negligence. I hope to ensure that no other family has to endure what mine is enduring. Thomas Flynn, from a letter by Mary Chen, sister of Nurse Elizabeth Chen, to the Providence Journal, November 1916. My sister Elizabeth was one of the 8 nurses murdered at St. Michael's Hospital. I write to ensure that she and her colleagues are remembered not just as victims, but as dedicated professionals who died trying to protect what they believed was a patient in danger. Edwin Blackwood deceived them. He told them a patient needed help, and they responded immediately, because that's what nurses do. They put themselves in danger to care for others. They should never have been in that position. The hospital should have had better protocols for dealing with potentially dangerous psychiatric patients. There should have been security accompanying nurses into isolated areas. There should have been regular checks on all hospital spaces. Instead, 8 women were sealed in a basement ward and left to die while the hospital searched everywhere except the place where they were trapped. This is a tragedy that should never have happened, and it must never happen again. Mary Chen. The trial of Edwin Blackwood was brief and its outcome predetermined. From newspaper accounts I learned he had been found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to the Rhode Island State Asylum for the Insane, where he remained until his death in 1934. From the Providence Journal, December 15th, 1916. Blackwood found not guilty by reason of insanity. Committed to state asylum. Edwin Blackwood has been found not guilty by reason of insanity in the murders of 8 St. Michael's Hospital nurses. Judge Robert Wilson, in his ruling, stated that while Blackwood clearly committed the acts in question, he was suffering from severe mental illness at the time and lacked the capacity to understand the nature or wrongfulness of his actions. Mr. Blackwood's paranoid schizophrenia rendered him unable to distinguish reality from delusion, Judge Wilson stated. In his deluded state, he believed he was protecting himself and others from a threat that existed only in his diseased mind. Blackwood has been committed indefinitely to the Rhode Island State Asylum for the Insane, where he will remain until such time as medical authorities determine he no longer poses a danger to himself or others. Family members of the victims expressed frustration with the verdict, feeling that justice has not been served. However, legal experts note that the insanity defense, while controversial, is well established in cases where severe mental illness eliminates the defendant's capacity for rational judgment. I found one more significant document in the materials, a statement written in 1956 by a former St. Michael's Hospital administrator, reflecting on the tragedy 40 years later. From the statement of Dr. George Mitchell, retired hospital administrator, 1956. I was a young physician at St. Michael's in 1916, just beginning my career. The murder of those 8 nurses haunted me throughout my 40 years in medicine and continues to haunt me now in retirement. We failed those women. The hospital administration, the medical staff, myself, we all failed them. Edwin Blackwood should never have had the freedom of movement that allowed him to execute his plan. Psychiatric patients with violent delusions should have been more closely supervised. Nurses who reported concerns about patient behavior should have been taken more seriously. But this was 1916. Understanding of mental illness was limited. Hospital security protocols were minimal, and the concerns of nurses, particularly when reporting uncomfortable feelings rather than concrete incidents, were often dismissed by male physicians and administrators who considered such concerns to be female nervousness rather than legitimate warnings. Those 8 nurses knew something was wrong with Edwin Blackwood. Multiple nurses reported feeling unsafe around him, feeling that he was planning something. But we dismissed those concerns. And then we put those same nurses in a position where Blackwood could harm them. After the tragedy, the basement ward where the murders occurred was sealed. It remained sealed until St. Michael's Hospital was finally demolished in 1965. No one wanted to use that space. No one wanted to be reminded of what had happened there. The hospital tried to move past the tragedy quietly. There was no memorial, no public acknowledgement beyond the immediate aftermath. We wanted to forget, to return to normal operations, to avoid the stain on our reputation. But those 8 women deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their story told honestly, including the ways we failed them. Sister Margaret Flynn, Catherine Walsh, Dorothy Patterson, Elizabeth Chen, Sarah Kowalski, Ruth Morrison, Anne Murphy, and Helen Foster were dedicated nurses who died trying to respond to what they believed was a patient in crisis. They were murdered by a man we were supposed to be supervising, and they were let down by an institution that failed to take their concerns seriously and failed to protect them adequately. I am 82 years old now. Of all the cases I witnessed in my medical career, this one remains the most haunting. Those 8 faces in the photograph, taken just weeks before their deaths, I can still see them clearly. Young women, dedicated professionals, completely unaware that they had less than a month to live. May they rest in peace. And may we learn from the failures that led to their deaths. I spent months researching the case further, visiting the site where St. Michael's Hospital had once stood, locating descendants of the murdered nurses, and examining records of similar cases in other institutions. What emerged was a picture of systemic failures, inadequate protocols for managing dangerous psychiatric patients, dismissal of nurses' safety concerns, and poor emergency response when staff went missing. I wrote a comprehensive account of the case, examining not just what happened but why it happened, and what it revealed about patient safety, institutional responsibility, and the historical dismissal of women's concerns in medical settings. The book was titled Sealed Ward: The Murder of 8 Nurses and the Failure of Institutional Responsibility in 1916. The book generated significant discussion among medical professionals, particularly those working in psychiatric care and hospital administration. The case of St. Michael's Hospital became a teaching example for the importance of taking staff safety concerns seriously and establishing proper protocols for managing potentially dangerous patients. The photograph of the 8 nurses appeared on the cover. Looking at it now, knowing what I know, it's almost unbearable. 8 women in their nursing uniforms with Red Cross insignia, looking professional and dedicated, completely unaware that a patient they would try to help in just a few weeks would instead trap and murder them all. Sister Margaret Flynn stands in the back row on the left, the head nurse, age 34. Catherine Walsh, Dorothy Patterson, and Elizabeth Chen stand beside her. Sarah Kowalski stands on the right end of the back row, just 24 years old, the youngest of the group. In the front row, Ruth Morrison, Anne Murphy, and Helen Foster sit in their white uniforms, looking directly at the camera. The photograph was taken in September 1916. On October 15, 1916, less than 6 weeks later, all 8 women were sealed in the basement ward of St. Michael's Hospital by Edwin Blackwood. They died over the course of approximately 2 days, trapped in darkness, their calls for help unheard. Their bodies were found on October 18th, 3 days after they disappeared, when the smell of death finally drew attention to the sealed basement ward. The photograph looked perfectly normal when I first saw it. Just 8 nurses from a Red Cross unit posed for a formal portrait in 1916. But it's actually a memorial to 8 women who died because an institution failed to protect them, because a system dismissed their concerns, because protocols were inadequate to prevent a tragedy everyone should have seen coming. May Sister Margaret Flynn, Catherine Walsh, Dorothy Patterson, Elizabeth Chen, Sarah Kowalski, Ruth Morrison, Anne Murphy, and Helen Foster rest in peace. May their families have found some comfort over the generations, and may their deaths have taught institutions to take staff safety more seriously, to listen when people express concerns, and to ensure that the vulnerable, whether patients or caregivers, are adequately protected. The photograph looked perfectly normal, but it captured 8 women in the final weeks of their lives, before they would be sealed in a basement ward and left to die in the darkness. An ordinary hospital photograph that became a memorial to tragedy, institutional failure, and 8 dedicated nurses who deserved so much better than the deaths they received. That's the truth preserved in this image from September 1916. That's the story that was hushed up for decades but deserves to be told. 8 nurses, 1 photograph, 1 horrific crime. 40 years of a sealed basement ward where they died. The photograph looked perfectly normal, until you learned that all 8 nurses were found sealed in the basement ward, murdered by a patient who used their dedication against them.